Have you ever tried to truly wrap your head around the Second World War? It's a conflict so vast, so world-altering, that it's almost impossible to grasp its full scale. We're talking about a war that raged across every inhabited continent, pulling in more than 100 million people from over 30 countries. It redrew the map of the world and reshaped the course of human history forever. So today, let's journey back in time, not just to list battles and dates, but to understand the human story, the key turning points, and the incredible ripple effects that we still feel to this day. This is the story of World War II. To understand how this global catastrophe happened, we have to go back to the end of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was meant to bring lasting peace. Instead, it planted the seeds of the next conflict. It imposed incredibly harsh terms on Germany, forcing the nation to accept full blame for the war, pay crippling reparations, and give up significant territory. This created a deep sense of national humiliation and economic desperation. In Italy, despite being on the winning side, people felt cheated, believing they didn't get the land they were promised. And in Japan, growing military power felt overlooked by the Western nations and wanted to build its own empire in Asia. Into this powder keg of resentment stepped charismatic and dangerous leaders. In Italy, Benito Mussolini and his fascist party rose to power, promising to restore national pride. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party capitalized on the economic chaos and public anger. He offered a simple, terrifying scapegoat for Germany's problems and promised a return to glory. Meanwhile, in Japan, a military-led government pursued aggressive expansion. Believing it was their destiny to dominate East Asia, these regimes, known as the Axis powers, shared a common disdain for democracy, a belief in their own national superiority, and a willingness to use brutal force to achieve their goals. The 1930s were a decade of escalating aggression. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, creating a puppet state. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. Then, Germany began to openly defy the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler rearmed the military and, in 1936, marched troops back into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone. The other European powers, like Britain and France, were haunted by the memory of World War I and desperate to avoid another war. They adopted a policy of appeasement, essentially giving in to Hitler's demands in the hope that he would eventually be satisfied. In 1938, they allowed him to annex parts of Czechoslovakia at the Munich Conference. But this only emboldened him. Aggression would be met with words, not action. The final straw came on September 1, 1939, after signing a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. A shocking move that gave him a free hand. Hitler invaded Poland. This time, Britain and France could no longer stand by. They declared war on Germany, and the Second World War in Europe had officially begun. The German military unleashed a new, terrifying form of warfare called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It was a devastating combination of fast-moving tanks, overwhelming air power, and coordinated infantry attacks. Poland fell in a matter of weeks. The world watched in horror as the German war machine seemed unstoppable. After a quiet period known as the Phony War, the blitzkrieg was unleashed again in the spring of 1940. Germany swiftly conquered Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Then they turned their attention to France, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line. German forces swept through the Ardennes forests, trapping the British and French armies on the beaches of Dunkirk. In one of the most remarkable rescue operations in history, a fleet of over 800 boats, including civilian fishing boats and yachts, evacuated more than 338,000 Allied soldiers. It was a miracle, but it couldn't change the fact that France had fallen. By June 1940, Hitler stood in Paris. Britain now stood alone. The Battle of Britain was the next crucial chapter. Hitler planned to invade the island, but first, he needed to control the skies. From July to October 1940, the German Luftwaffe launched a massive air campaign against the United Kingdom. They bombed airfields, military targets, and eventually civilian cities in a campaign known as the Blitz. But the Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, put up a heroic defense. With advanced radar technology and the legendary Spitfire and Hurricane fighter planes, British pilots fought back with incredible courage. As Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." By the end of 1940, the invasion was called off. Britain had survived, while Europe was in flames. The war was also raging in Asia. Japan continued its brutal invasion of China and expanded its ambitions across the Pacific, seeking resources like oil and rubber. The United States, officially neutral, was growing increasingly alarmed by Axis aggression. They began supplying aid to Britain and imposed an oil embargo on Japan to try and halt their expansion. Japan's leadership saw this as an act of aggression that threatened their survival. They decided on a bold, high-stakes gamble to cripple the American fleet in one swift blow. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack was devastating. The United States declared war on Japan, and a few days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. The conflict was now truly a world war. The entry of the United States and the Soviet Union, which Germany had invaded in June 1941, completely changed the dynamic of the war. This created the Grand Alliance of the Big Three: the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. But 1942 was a dark year. The Axis powers were at the peak of their power. Germany pushed deep into the Soviet Union, reaching the city of Stalingrad, and Rommel, the Desert Fox, was driving across North Africa toward Egypt. In the Pacific, Japan conquered the Philippines, Singapore, and much of Southeast Asia. It seemed the Axis might actually win. But then came the turning points. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a stunning victory for the U.S. Navy. Having cracked Japanese naval codes, they were able to ambush the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 of their aircraft carriers. It was a crippling blow from which the Japanese Navy never fully recovered. In North Africa, the British defeated Rommel at the Battle of El Alamein, starting the long push to drive the Axis out of Africa. And most significantly, on the Eastern Front, the brutal, city-destroying Battle of Stalingrad ended in a catastrophic defeat for Germany. The Soviet Red Army surrounded and destroyed the entire German Sixth Army. From this point forward, the German army would be on the defensive in the East. With the tide turning, the Allies began to plan the liberation of Europe. The first step was the invasion of Italy in 1943. Allied forces landed in Sicily and slowly fought their way up the Italian peninsula. Mussolini was overthrown, but German forces fiercely defended the territory, leading to a long and bloody campaign. All the while, preparations were being made for the largest amphibious invasion in history, the invasion of Normandy, codenamed Operation Overlord. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Over 150,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy in France. Despite facing brutal German resistance, they established a beachhead. This was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. As Allied forces pushed from the west, the Soviet Union advanced relentlessly from the east. The liberation of France was completed in August 1944. The Allies then fought their way across Germany itself. In a last desperate gamble, Hitler launched a major counteroffensive in the winter of 1944, known as the Battle of the Bulge, but it failed. By the spring of 1945, Soviet troops were fighting in the streets of Berlin. On April 30th, with his empire collapsing around him, Adolf Hitler died by suicide in his bunker. A week later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. This is known as V-Day, victory in Europe. But the war wasn't over. The Pacific, fighting against Japan, was incredibly fierce. Allied forces adopted a strategy of island hopping, capturing key islands one by one to get closer to Japan. Battles on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa were some of the bloodiest of the war, as Japanese soldiers fought with a fanatical determination to defend their homeland. U.S. leaders feared that a full-scale invasion of Japan would cost over 1 million Allied casualties and even more Japanese lives. To avoid this and bring a swift end to the war, U.S. President Harry Truman made the difficult decision to use a new, devastating weapon. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction was unprecedented. A few days later, on August 15th, Japan announced its surrender, officially ending World War II. The aftermath was staggering. The war cost an estimated 70 to 85 million lives, the deadliest conflict in human history. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Economies were shattered. The Holocaust revealed the true scale of Nazi barbarity, a genocide that systematically murdered 6 million Jews and millions of other victims. The world was changed forever. The old European empires crumbled. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two new global superpowers, setting the stage for the decades-long Cold War. To prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again, the United Nations was formed with the goal of promoting international cooperation and peace. The Second World War is a story of immense tragedy, but is also a story of incredible courage, sacrifice, and resilience. It serves as a permanent reminder of the dangers of unchecked aggression, hatred, and intolerance, but also of what humanity can achieve when it unites against a common threat. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey through history interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. See you next time.